The office party was one of those obligatory events that Daniel Hayes would have gladly skipped if he could, but as a single father working hard to keep his position secure, he knew better than to test his luck. He was a quiet man, not one for loud music, clinking glasses, or small talk that never led to anything real, but the company insisted that attendance at the annual celebration was strongly encouraged, which in his boss's language really meant mandatory. The banquet hall glittered under chandeliers, laughter spilled over the tables, and the air smelled of champagne and ambition, but Daniel kept to the corner, nursing a single glass of soda while his colleagues mingled and laughed a little too loudly. His boss, Victoria Steele, was the center of attention as always, commanding, elegant, and untouchable in her designer gown, her every move drawing eyes as if she were royalty among commoners. She had built her reputation on sharp intelligence and unshakable control, the kind of woman who could silence a room with a look, and Daniel had always thought of her as someone carved from stone, incapable of bending. But as the night wore on, and the glasses of wine at her table multiplied, cracks began to show in that polished image. She laughed too freely, leaned too heavily on the back of her chair, and when she finally tried to stand, she stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the table before anyone else could react. Her employees exchanged knowing smirks, some whispering behind their hands, but not one of them moved forward, unwilling to risk being caught in a moment that might later be twisted into weakness. Daniel felt the weight of silence pressing on him, and against his better judgment, he stepped forward. "Ma'am, maybe you should head home," he said softly, his voice low enough to protect her dignity but firm enough to be heard over the music. She blinked at him, her eyes glassy with drink, and gave a laugh that sounded nothing like the clipped, controlled chuckle he had heard in boardrooms. "Home. Daniel, I can barely find my shoes." She wobbled again, and this time, Daniel caught her arm before she could fall. His colleagues stared, their gazes heavy with curiosity, some even with envy at the strange sight of their intimidating boss leaning against one of the quietest men in the office. He didn't care what they thought, he only knew that she couldn't get behind the wheel in this state. "I'll take you home," he offered, keeping his voice steady, though the absurdity of the situation was not lost on him. She leaned into him with surprising trust, her perfume filling his senses as he guided her through the hushed crowd and out into the cool night air. The city lights flickered against the car windows as he opened the passenger door for her, and for the first time in years, Daniel realized he was about to see his boss not as a figure on a pedestal but as a vulnerable human being. He slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and with one last glance at her resting heavily against the glass, he pulled away from the party, unaware that this small act of kindness would change the course of his life in ways he never could have imagined. The drive through the city was quiet, the hum of the engine filling the silence between them as neon lights painted fleeting streaks of color across the windshield, and Daniel kept his eyes fixed firmly on the road, determined not to let the strangeness of the situation distract him. Beside him, Victoria sat slouched against the seat, her normally perfect posture gone, her head tilted slightly as though even holding it upright required too much energy. For a long stretch, she said nothing, until suddenly her voice broke through the hush, low and wavering, so unlike the commanding tone he knew from the office. "You're different from the others," she murmured, her gaze unfocused as she looked out the window. Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel, unsure what she meant. "Different how?" he asked cautiously, not wanting to push but curious nonetheless. She gave a soft laugh, almost bitter. "They all want something from me, approval, promotions, money, power. They smile when I'm around and whisper when I'm gone. But you're just kind." Her words unsettled him, not because they weren't flattering, but because they revealed a side of her he had never considered, a loneliness hidden beneath her polished exterior, a woman weighed down by suspicion and expectations. When they finally pulled into the garage of her high-rise apartment, Daniel parked and hurried around to help her out of the car, her arm looping around his for balance as she leaned against him like a lifeline. The elevator ride was awkwardly silent, broken only by her faint humming of a tune he didn't recognize, and when the doors opened to her floor, she stumbled into the sleek, minimalistic luxury of her home. The space was immaculate, gleaming marble floors, sharp lines, and expensive furniture, but it felt cold, devoid of warmth, like a hotel more than a home. She collapsed onto the couch with a dramatic sigh, clutching a throw pillow like it was an anchor, and then turned her tired eyes toward him. "Don't leave yet," she whispered, her voice almost pleading, and Daniel hesitated at the threshold of her living room, torn between propriety and compassion. "Just stay until I'm not dizzy anymore," she added, her tone softening as if afraid he might say no. He nodded slowly and remained standing, his presence more like a quiet shadow than a guest, until she suddenly asked, "You're a single dad, right?" He blinked in surprise but answered, "Yeah. Just me and my daughter." Victoria studied him for a long moment, her eyes glassy but intent. "That's brave," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I couldn't even take care of myself tonight, and you're raising a child. That strength I'll never have." Her words caught him off guard, and for the first time since he had met her, he saw tears shimmer in her eyes before she quickly turned her face away, ashamed of letting anyone witness such vulnerability. "Thank you, Daniel," she murmured, her voice barely audible, before exhaustion pulled her into sleep on the couch, leaving him standing in the vast silence of her apartment, wondering if the woman he thought he knew was someone entirely different beneath the armor she wore each day. Daniel barely slept that night, the memory of his boss's fragile voice echoing in his head as he lay awake in his modest apartment, the steady breathing of his daughter in the next room a comforting reminder of his purpose, yet his mind couldn't shake the image of Victoria Steele, the woman who commanded entire boardrooms with the flick of a glance, curled up on her couch like someone who had finally let herself fall apart. He had covered her with a blanket before leaving, locking the door quietly behind him, and as he walked into the office the next morning, the familiar hum of printers and chatter felt heavier than usual, his stomach knotted with unease as he wondered how she would face him, or if she would punish him for seeing her so unguarded. He braced himself when she arrived, every inch the picture of poise in her tailored suit, her heels clicking against the floor as if nothing had happened, though he noticed the faint shadows beneath her eyes, the only sign of her long night. To his surprise, after the morning meeting, she called his name with a voice softer than usual and asked him to step into her office, her employees exchanging curious glances as he closed the door behind him. For a moment, she said nothing, simply studying him from behind her massive oak desk, her expression unreadable, until finally she let out a slow breath and murmured, "I owe you both an apology and a thank you." Daniel blinked, caught off guard, unsure how to respond, but she continued before he could speak. "Last night, I wasn't myself, and I don't usually allow anyone to see me that way. I hate losing control. But you didn't take advantage of that, you helped me, and that means more than I can explain." He shifted awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck, and replied, "I just did what anyone would have done." At that, she gave a small, almost disbelieving smile and shook her head. "No, Daniel, not anyone would have. Most people would have used it against me, or at the very least never let me forget it. But you protected my dignity, even when I gave you no reason to." Her gaze softened, and for the first time, he realized her steel-like exterior wasn't only armor against the world but also a prison she had built for herself. "You mentioned your daughter last night," she added quietly. "I admire the strength it must take to raise her alone." Daniel froze, his throat tightening at her words, because he wasn't used to being noticed, not like this, not by someone who usually only spoke to him in clipped commands about deadlines and reports. "Thank you," he managed to whisper, and when he looked up, she was smiling, not the polished, professional smirk she used in meetings, but a genuine smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face into something warm, almost gentle. In that moment, Daniel realized that everything between them had shifted, that what had begun as an awkward accident was slowly unraveling into something that could no longer be contained by the boundaries of boss and employee, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of possibility he hadn't dared imagine. In the weeks that followed, something intangible shifted between Daniel and Victoria, though neither spoke of it aloud. It was there in the way she lingered at his desk after meetings, asking about his daughter Lily with genuine curiosity, and in the way her eyes softened when she caught him leaving the office early to pick her up from school, no longer a silent disapproval but an understanding that spoke volumes. One Friday evening, to his utter surprise, Victoria appeared outside the small elementary school where Lily was waiting, holding a neatly wrapped book in her hand. She smiled shyly as she handed it to the little girl, saying she thought Lily might enjoy it since Daniel had once mentioned her love for stories, and Lily's eyes lit up as though she had been given a treasure. Soon, Victoria began stopping by their modest apartment now and then, not as a boss but as a guest, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor beside Lily, helping with puzzles or listening to her endless chatter about school, her laughter ringing in the cramped space in a way that made it feel brighter, warmer, more alive than it ever had before. Daniel watched those moments quietly, his heart swelling with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, and he realized that the woman he once thought of as unapproachable had slowly become part of their little world. One evening after dinner, with Lily asleep in her room and the faint sound of her music box playing through the thin walls, Victoria lingered at the door, hesitating as though wrestling with words, before finally turning to him with a look that stripped away every layer of steel she normally wore. "Daniel," she said softly, "that night you drove me home, it was the first time in years I felt like someone saw me as more than just my title. You didn't treat me like the boss or the woman everyone whispers about, you treated me like a person. And I want you to know. I see you too. Not just as my employee, but as a man, and as a father who deserves more credit than anyone gives you." Her voice trembled at the end, and for a long moment, silence filled the air between them, broken only by the ticking of the old clock on the wall, until Daniel finally found his voice, low and unsteady. "I never expected anything to change that night," he admitted, his eyes meeting hers with a vulnerability he rarely allowed. "But maybe it was meant to happen, because it brought you here, to us." Her lips curved into a smile, soft and real, and when she reached out to take his hand, it felt like the closing of a circle that had been incomplete for far too long. That night marked not just the beginning of a new chapter in their lives but the promise of a future neither of them had dared to imagine, where strength and softness, loneliness and love, could finally find a place to belong.